analysis around what SB 50 does. We did around SB 827 last year at the direction of the Planning Commission and Supervisor Peskin. We said, you need to tell us what the hell this thing's going to do to the city, this SB 827. And the Planning Department produced a document that went all around the state in its excellence in understanding what the actual impact was going to be. And preceding that, we had this thing called the Affordable Housing Density Bonus Program, which morphed into Home SF. And we had public hearings around that. So we had all these hearings and we recommended to the boards from a planning commission whether we supported it or not based on all the in-depth analysis that we did. Then the board held another hearing and they actually vetted all this stuff out. None of that's been done yet. So this is Dennis Richards' private citizen's personal opinion on what I think will happen. So I don't represent planning department or anything. This is, somebody said to me, on the back of an envelope, tell me what this does. And that's what I put together. So today, the top left, we have what's called, I'll call it local discretion. Local control, when you mentioned it out to anybody in Sacramento, they die. You know, they freeze up in the back, the hair on the back of their neck goes up, because local control is a bad thing. Local control code got us into this problem. So we have nearly total local control today. And what does local control mean? It's called the San Francisco Planning Code, Planning and Zoning, okay? We have a planning commission in the middle of the page. We do conditional use permits. The zoning administrator does variances. The planning commission hears discretionary reviews on building permits. And the Board of Appeals and the Board of Supervisors is the final appeal path before the courts, depending on the type of entitlement. So it's total local control. What are the things that we actually have local control over? The purple: height, density, setbacks, lot mergers, use size, parking, massing, exposure requirements, rear yard requirements, floor area ratio, demolition controls, design standards, and impact fees. I call those your livability standards. You don't have a setback for no reason. You don't want to live right on top of your neighbor and look in his bedroom, right? You want to have some mid-block open space, which is why we have rear yard requirements, right? We did just get rid of the parking minimum, just happened recently, so that's one we can scratch off this list. Demolition controls is something that's going to be coming very, very soon. And I'm worried that it's not going to be held constitutional based on some of the other legislation that I read that Scott Wiener's legislation points to. So I'm very worried about that. Now I can get into that if you want, but I'm watching the clock click off. They make up 98% of the projects. 1%, the bottom left-hand corner, we have what I call quasi-discretionary review. It's about 1% of the projects, or probably even less. It applies to currently zoned lots where there is an allowable increase in the number of units, and the zoning will allow, number of units, the zoning will allow, and the project proposes additional number of units, even if it involves a complete demolition of the building, and is, quote, code complying and does not need any exceptions to the planning code. So we have had a couple of these. We had one in the Mission 792 Cap Street. We had one in Ashbury Heights, 137 Clayton, and we had another one, it escapes me, where we could not disapprove the demolition because the new project provided increased density based on the Housing Accountability Act, which Scott Wiener, when he unveiled his Building Equitable Communities summary, the key line in here that jumped out to me was on page 2, and he says, preservation of local control. Under this legislation, all housing projects are still subject to CEQA and existing labor and employment standards, development fees, community engagement process, and architectural design review. And each housing development will remain as additionally anti-demolition. A local government retains existing authority to ban, prohibit, restrict, demolish of existing housing consistent with the Housing Accountability Act. That caught me, because what that's saying is you have local control, but you don't, because in the new SB 50, the developer gets to pick what's code complying. It's a developer decides the planning code. So let's take a look back here. That's the, so the 1% were these ones where we had to approve the project, and because of the Housing Accountability Act, we had to make findings of objective standards for public health and safety, objective standards, which pretty much don't exist. We had a 2918 Mission Street was this big high-rise that a developer proposed, and we were trying to, go ahead.
Yeah, 2918 was the 25th and Mission laundromat. So what it allowed was building 2 extra floors while not increasing the affordability and actually essentially reducing the affordability. So what ended up coming out of a 78-unit project was essentially 10.8% affordable. So,
and the developer got additional massing height and bulk. I mean, he got to pick 3 things based on the state density bonus law, which is also something that Supervisor or Senator Wiener points to in his SB 50, giving the developer the option to pick one of 3 of these items in purple, there might be more, to make their project, quote, feasible. And the give back is yet to be determined in the number of affordable units. So we're sacrificing livability for density. Basically, that, I mean, when you want to start summing things up, we're throwing the livability out, and they want to increase density. So that's 1% of the projects that invoke the Housing Accountability Act. So developers have gotten so brazen, they've come up to the Planning Commission podium and said, if you don't approve this project, we're going to sue you under the Housing Accountability Act. And the city attorney, you know, she starts shaking because, you know, we're all afraid that we're going to be sued. Today we have no discretion at all. It's all state control. That was the project on 2918 Mission, where they invoked a density bonus and set their own planning code, and we can't do anything about it. So you have this layer upon layer upon layer of laws that basically force us into the corner where we can't do anything. That's what SB 50 does in a nutshell. If you look on the top right-hand side, under SB 50, in my view of the world, discretionary decisions and local control would end up going from 98% to 5%. So probably the only thing that we'd have control over, say on demolition, would be an expansion of a single-family home that remains a single-family home, where they're having quality of life issues with the neighbor. You know, they want to have this massive home that shades the garden, and you know, that's about the only thing. It's and cannabis clubs and formula retail and the other stuff the Planning Commission does. Basically, you don't need the Planning Commission anymore to vet anything out. The state's going to do it. No, the developer is going to do it because the state allows it to, and everything will be approved by the planning department with no public review and no recourse after the building permit is issued. Those orange posters you see on the wall that say, notice of issuance of building permit, you have so many days to appeal. That's gone. There's no discretion. Okay? Quasi-discretionary controls, where there's some state control, maybe 1% of the projects, and then no discretionary decisions, SB 50 on the top right of the second page. All that stuff basically now goes into SB 50. And SB 50 points to the state density bonus and says developer gets to pick up to 3 of these things in the purple, and that makes it code complying. So if it's code complying, we can't say no, right? So you see the circle that's been created with these 3 laws, SB 50, density bonus, and Housing Accountability Act. It forces all 3 laws to work in concert to create Governor Brown's 2016 by right legislation. It's a really interesting, crafty way that's so confusing. It took me a couple of weeks to try to understand it. The one caveat that I'm learning, and I met this morning with my supervisor and the director of San Francisco Heritage, as well as the president of the Historic Preservation Commission. It looks like there is a shred of hope if the structure that you're in question that's going to be altered or destroyed, demolished, is on the California Register of Historic Places. That's about the only thing we can hang. It's like hanging from a hair, you know, and trying to grab onto it. So one of the things I want to end with here is our neighborhood, DuBose Triangle, was surveyed in 2008 as part of a rezoning called Market Octavia. Half of it was surveyed. The other half wasn't. We're actually raising money we signed a contract with a certified historic preservation consultant to finish the survey and to list our neighborhood on the state California register so that every contributing structure in that district is protected. And I found out this morning there's no massive map of the city that says there's all these eligible districts that have been identified. Just in my neighborhood alone, there's, I think, 7 within maybe a half-mile radius of where my house is, that we need to get listed so that there's protection. It's a good defensive move until they take that away from us, because CEQA reform is apparently next on Governor Newsom and Scott Wiener's list to bludgeon. That's what I have to say. It's grim. It's pretty grim.
You guys pass these
The problem
back so everybody gets one.
The problem is, it's so complicated, and so it's almost like, a small climate change. Until you actually see the impact, the sea level rising, or whatever, you don't really realize it. And what I'm afraid of is, once this thing passes, and the bulldozer rides down your street and demolishes the house next to you, is it going to set in? And that's what's going to happen. And people are going to say, what happened? And we're going to say, I tried to tell you.
That's like the mission.
Yeah. So that's my pitch. We need awareness. And when I heard you had $60,000 in the bank, I thought you should have a mailer to every single family home in the city, telling them what this is going to do. That would be a good use of that money.